live stream for UFC Fight Night Rafael dos Anjos against Rafael Fiziev, which starts in, I think, around 5 hours from now. So we got a good amount of time to go through each of these matchups and try to find a decent over-under bet for every single fight on this card. So I'm just going to check that the live streams are working. So we're working on Twitch, and let's see if YouTube's up and running. It is excellent. Alright, everything looks to be working absolutely fine. We'll just do the final check by going to my channel, and yeah, we're good. Okay, we are good. So first of all, I want to say a massive thank you to all of you that hit the like button on my YouTube breakdown video this week for Fiziev versus RDA. We said that if that video got 150 likes, we'd do this over under live stream, and here we are. Really appreciate it, and I'm going to try and do the same thing next week as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through each one of the matchups on this card. We're going to look at the odds on the over-under for each fight on this card, and we're going to talk about the fight from an over-under point of view. And I'm going to let you guys know whether I think the fight is more likely to go the distance or not. In fact, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is let you guys know which over or under has the better risk to reward ratio from a betting point of view. You know, not necessarily what the most likely outcome of the fight is, but more so, you know, which bet is going to give you the better risk to reward ratio, which is the better bet to go with. And I'll also let you know if I've got any over-under bets myself on this card, because obviously you don't want to be betting every single fight. Not a good idea. Much better to be a little bit more selective than that. But I do have a couple of over-unders on this card, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you, because I think that there's a couple really good over-unders on this event. So let's get into it. Start off with the first fight, which is going to be Ronnie Lawrence against Sayukub Kakramanov. So in terms of how I see this one from an over-under point of view, I do think this fight is more likely to go the distance. The problem is, even though I feel this fight is more likely to go the distance, there are big risks to betting this fight to go the distance, because both guys are dangerous in their own ways. So the reason why I think this fight is more likely to go the distance is because both these guys are super tough. You know, Ronnie Lawrence, we've seen him hurt in some of his past fights. It's very difficult to put him away because he's got a great gas tank and he's really well conditioned. He's really good at recovering when he gets hurt. So even though he's not the best defensively, and we've seen him get dropped and wobbled a few times in his past fights, the fact that he was able to kind of work through it, hang in there and recover very quickly is a sign that it's not going to be easy to put him away. So that's one of the first reasons why I feel, you know, this fight's more likely to go the distance. On the flip side, we know that Kakramanov is also a pretty tough guy. We could feel a little less confident about how Kakramanov is going to react when put in bad positions, because there's not as much good quality footage on Kakramanov as we have on Lawrence. But what I would say is that Lawrence is a lot less dangerous than Kakramanov. When you look at Kakramanov's past fights, he does seem to have an abnormal amount of power for the division. He does hit very hard, does have legit one-shot KO power, and we know Lawrence isn't the best defensively. He is prone to getting dinged, so I wouldn't rule out the possibility of Kakramanov landing a knockout here. But in terms of what Lawrence brings to the table, he's more of a gritty grinder, just a guy that fights at a high pace, likes to drive his opponents into the cage and wear on them with his, you know, relentless grappling. But when he gets his grappling game going, he's not particularly dangerous with it. It's not like he has, you know, a dangerous submission game, and it's not like he inflicts a lot of damage with his grappling. He's not really a submission grappler. He's more of a guy that takes you down and controls you. So for those reasons, I think the fight is more likely to go the distance. But I'm not a fan of the over in this fight. Personally, I won't be betting it myself, simply because if we look at the odds, you know, they're in that 1.61 odds range, which is going to be minus 164 for an implied probability of 62%. And on top of that, you know, we've already said that there's not tons of footage on Kakramanov, so we don't really know what to expect from him if he's put in bad positions. And Lawrence is tough, difficult to put away, but he is susceptible to getting wobbled. And we know Kakramanov has got big power. So let's move on to the next fight. I won't be betting now on myself, but I do think the matchup's more likely to go the distance. Now let's take a look at the fight between David Onama and Garrett Armfield. So, in terms of the odds on the over-under on this one, we can see that the under 2.5 rounds is quite a big odds spread there. It looks like the main line, the high liquidity line here, is set at over 1.5 or under 1.5 rounds, which I do understand. Onama's dangerous on the feet. Armfield coming in on less than a week's notice, but we can see fight does or does not go the distance is about 1.44 to 2.65. Look, I do feel that this fight is a lot more likely to end inside the distance than to go the distance, simply because there's a big size difference in this one. We know Onama's dangerous on the feet, and we also know he's got a big size advantage over Armfield in this matchup. If I were to pick whether it's more like, let's focus on the high liquidity line, which looks to be the over under 1.5 rounds. If I was to say, is the fight more or less likely to go over 1.5 or under 1.5, I would say it's more likely to go over 1.5 rounds. This is one of those fights where I don't think it'll go the distance, but I could see it going over 1.5 rounds past that 7.5 minute mark. The reason why I feel the fight's more likely to go over 1.5 rounds is because David Onama's takedown defense is extremely bad. Like, if you try to take him down, you can get him down pretty easily, and he's quite weak off his back as well. So early in the fight, when Garrett Armfield is fresh, if he starts to get into trouble on the feet, I think he's going to be able to take Onama down and alleviate some pressure, rack up a little bit of top control and run the clock down, which would obviously help the fight get closer to that 7.5 minute mark where the over 1.5 rounds would hit. Now, because Armfield is taking the fight on less than a week's notice, and Onama is difficult to hold down, like he's a big strong guy that is pretty good at working his way back up to his feet, I think you will see Onama get a stoppage in this fight, but I think it's more likely to come after the midway point of the fight, after Armfield has started to get tired, from trying to take Onama down and out grapple him. So I do think that over 1.5 rounds is the better side to go with here, but I won't be betting it myself for a couple of reasons. The first reason being, we don't really know what kind of shape Armfield is coming into this fight in. Sure, I'm sure he's in the gym all the time, training very hard. You'd assume that he could fight at a reasonably good pace for 7.5 minutes, because when you go back and look at his past fights, he hasn't given us any reason to doubt his cardio. His gas tankers look very good. So for that reason, I do think he will probably be able to hang in there for 7.5 minutes, but ultimately we don't know. He's taking a fight on less than a week's notice. We are just guessing at the end of the day. So that's one of the reasons why I don't like it. The other reason is because Onama could have improved his takedown defense. He could be a lot more difficult to take down now than he was in his UFC debut against Mason Jones. And on top of that, we know Onama is very dangerous on the feet, so I could for sure see him catching Armfield with a flash KO, something like that. But if you do want to bet the over-under on this one, I would go with the over 1.5 rounds, but I won't be betting it myself. There's a lot of risk factors there with that. If I'm going to bet over-unders, I like to bet over-unders where there aren't any major risk factors, and I don't feel like that is the case with that one. So now let's talk about the next one, which is going to be Carl Roberson against Kennedy and Chukwu. Just got a couple questions on YouTube. Socrates, how you doing, mate? What's up, Socrates? I don't bet parlays, no, mate. Parlays are not something that I ever bet. Mateus Gamelgard is asking if anyone's on Michael Johnson. I'm not, mate. Even though Michael Johnson's a decent sized underdog, I think Malarkey wins this fight a really high percentage of the time, just because I think at this stage in their careers, Malarkey's more dangerous on the feet, and he's got a big advantage when it comes to grappling. We know Michael Johnson's takedown offense isn't great. He caves if you put him in bad positions on the ground. So for that reason, I think Malarkey gets it done a really high percentage of the time. So the Burns is saying Johnson won one fight in this decade against the worst guy in the division. Has he really won one fight this decade? By decade, do you mean like 2020 to 2022, or earlier than that, like the last 10 years, like 2022 to 2012? Hoverick Christian is saying, how did you build your bankroll? So in the early days, so I've been betting on MMA for about 15 years now. So going back 15 years, the MMA betting landscape was a lot different to how it is now. In fact, the MMA betting landscape back in the UK in 20 or 15 years ago is a lot similar to how it's like in the United States at the moment. So, in the United States, a lot of the betting sites offer like big deposit bonuses, like get 50% deposit bonus up to $1,500, stuff like that. So we don't have that in the UK anymore. Like deposit bonuses are not really a thing in the UK anymore, because people like took advantage of them with match betting and stuff and made it too expensive for the betting sites to offer bonuses. But back in the day, going back 15 years, all the betting sites offered them. So what I used to do would be deposit money into a betting site, get the deposit bonus, bet on MMA to kind of work off that deposit bonus, and then once the deposit bonus has been worked off, make a withdrawal, go deposit into another site, get another deposit bonus with another site, and repeat that process. So that helps you grow your bankroll quite quickly, because obviously as soon as you deposit, you're basically getting free money, and as long as you can stay alive and obviously not go broke by the time that you've worked that bonus off, you get a big chunk of additional cash. And then I started to get really, really good at live betting on UFC. So back then you could grow small amounts of money you can still grow small amounts of money into a large amounts of money very, very quickly. Back in, going back 20, 15 years ago, it was a lot easier back then. Also back then, pre-fight betting was a lot easier. So now you've got tons of handicappers researching these UFC fights, betting the fights early, adjusting the odds, making the odds more accurate. Going back 15 years ago, there were no MMA handicappers, literally zero. So it was a wild, wild west, man, and you could find loads of value on so many fights on every UFC card, where it's a lot more difficult now. So when I started 15 years ago, it was a lot easier to grow a bankroll very quickly than it is now. As you got the deposit bonuses, pre-fight betting was a lot easier, live betting was a lot easier. So generally speaking, it was much more lucrative betting on MMA than it is now. That's how I did it, man. But a lot has changed. This is a completely different game these days, where it's a lot harder. So I feel bad for you guys just starting out. It is tough. You can still make a lot of money in live betting, though. Live betting is still a big cash cow. Just more difficult than it used to be. How about RDA sub in 3, 4, or 5 pays odds of 18.0? I do like that, mate. I do like that. That's a nice prop. I would bet that for sure. Yeah. Based on the Bobby Green fight, I do think there's a good chance that Fiziev slows down. Although, someone in my community earlier on, I think it was Qualium. Qualium lives in Thailand. Where is it? So, yeah, Qualium lives in Thailand. So he's got a relationship with the guys at Tiger Muay Thai. Qualium was letting us know in the VIP chat earlier on that he's spoken to his friends at Tiger Muay Thai, and they've said that Fiziev's gas tank is actually amazing, and that it was just like a one-off, anomaly when he gassed against Bobby Green. So I'm keeping an open mind on Fiziev's gas tank. Like I say, you don't want to write one guy off and be too harsh on a guy for just gassing out in one fight. Guys that come out of Tiger Muay Thai usually have really good gas tanks. So it is really only the one fight that Fiziev has gassed in. But yeah, I do think RDA to get a submission in rounds 3, 4, or 5 at odds at 18.0 is not bad. Because if Fiziev does gas like he did against Bobby Green, he's not going to have the energy to defend himself on the ground late on when RDA's taking him down and wearing on him. So yeah, I like that, dude. That's a good bet. Kovic Christian is saying only singles, no parlays. Yeah, for the most part, I just bet singles, like money line bets and over-unders. So I do pretty good on over-unders. I'll show you my profitability chart on over-unders. That's the reason why I'm doing these live streams, because I do perform pretty good on over-under bets. We keep scrolling. There we go. So obviously had a massive dip, some nasty variance on over-unders, you know, in the second half of last year, but I think we'll start to grind our way back up now. Just had a lot of bad luck in a short space of time where I was betting stuff like, I can actually show you now, if we go back up to the bets database. Here we go. So you can kind of see the losses that I was taking. Oh, spoiler alert, there's the over-unders I'm going to be talking to you about in this video. We'll quickly skip through them so we don't spoil the surprise. We'll get to them in a little bit. But yeah, you could see towards the end of last year we were just losing money on you know, lots of fights that were a bit unlucky, man, for over-unders. You can see you know, things like Justin Gaethje, Michael Chandler, lost the under bet. We all saw how crazy that fight was, pretty unlucky there. Rose versus Weili Zhang, thought it was quite unlikely that one would go the distance at even money. I thought that was a good bet. So yeah, we just took a lot of losses in a short space of time, as you can see on this page, which is why we had this nasty dip. But I'm pretty confident when you look at this nice uptrend here. Over the course of like 18 months, we did nothing but win for pretty much 18 months non-stop. So I'm confident we can bounce back, man. We always do. So anyway, let's get into hey, what's up, Bunkoots, mate? Hope you're doing good. So let's get into the over/under on the next fight. So we've spoken about that one. So the next one's Kennedy Nzechukwu against Carl Roberson. So what are the odds looking like on this one? So we've got around even, actually there's quite a big odds spread, anywhere from 1.56 to 1.71. Do you know what's really difficult about this fight from an over-under point of view? Both guys have shown that they cave when put in bad positions. So how many times have we seen Carl Roberson kind of turtle up on the ground and completely cave? He did it in his last fight against Khalil Roundtree. Didn't defend himself well on the ground against Brendan Allen. Same goes for the Marvin Vettori fight. Like, Carl Roberson is one of these guys that if the fight's not going his way and he gets put in a bad position, he'll just look for a way out and wave the white flag. So for that reason, it's very difficult to feel confident in the fight going the distance. On the flip side, Kennedy Nzechukwu is a very inconsistent fighter, because in some of his matchups he looks ridiculously durable and, you know, really, really tough. You look at the Carlos Ulberg fight, that was an absolute war. I know he got dinged a couple times, but he hung in there, weathered the early storm, dragged Ulberg into the second round and really took over. Whereas if you look at Nzechukwu's fights against Da Un Jung, and to some extent, you know, his fight against Ulberg early, he was getting wobbled very, very easily. Like, Nzechukwu is a fighter that has seemed a bit chinny. But then a complete contradiction of that is his last fight, where he went the distance against Nick Negumereanu, who we know hits extremely hard. So when I look at both these guys, from an over-under point of view, we know Robeson's likely to quit when put in bad positions. We know Nzechukwu's looked a little bit chinny at times. Therefore, a combination of those two things probably mean that this fight's less likely to go to a decision, right? More likely to end inside the distance. So from an over-under point of view, I actually quite like this fight doesn't go to a decision. I guess what I really like about this fight not going to a decision is that Nzechukwu is very aggressive. So Nzechukwu's one of these guys that will push the pace and will force the action. And because of that, he's going to force Roberson to engage. And since Roberson is the kind of guy that'll cave when put under pressure, and Nzechukwu is quite chinny, and you can see Robeson's like a big, explosive, powerful guy, I think this fight's much more likely to end inside the distance. In fact, I quite like that. What happens is, like, when I break fights down, when I talk out loud how I interpret the fight going based on my research, quite often I'll when I'm like analysing everything, I will then actually come up with bets, man. I will then be like, oh, you know what? I didn't look at it like that. But when I've regurgitated everything and processed everything in my mind, I actually like that bet. So I'm going to go for that, man. I do like that quite a lot. So let me just add this in right here. and we will get into the next fight. So that's going to be Carl Roberson versus Kennedy and Chukwu, and we're going to go for where are the odds? Fight doesn't go to a decision, so quite a big odds spread. So anything from 1.72 to 1.62. So I guess we will meet in the middle at average odds of, say, like 1.65. So fight doesn't go to a decision. I really like bets like this because both guys can contribute to it winning. One of the best parts about over-under bets, I think one of the reasons why we perform so well on over-under bets is because both guys can contribute to the bet winning. So, for example, if you were to bet on Nchukwu or Roberson to win this fight, if you were to bet money line on Nchukwu or Roberson, you need to rely on one of those fighters doing their job, right? And if you bet Nchukwu, he's got to go out there, avoid getting knocked out, perform well, and win the fight. But when you bet over-unders, you don't need to rely on either guy. Like, if Nchukwu underperforms tonight, if Nchukwu's not as aggressive as he usually is, or if he shows up and looks a little bit chinny like he has in the past, well, that's great, because our bet can still win if we bet on the under. If you bet Nchukwu tonight to win and he underperforms, you probably lose that bet. But if you bet on the under on this fight instead, well, if Nchukwu underperforms and Roberson knocks him out, well, your bet on the under still wins. So I really like over-unders for that reason, and I think that that's one of the reasons why we perform so well, because it takes a lot of the variance and a lot of the risk out of the equation, where both fighters can contribute to the bet winning instead of just one. So let's focus on the next fight now, which is going to be Tresean Gore against Cody Brundage. Let's take a look at this one. I'll catch up on the YouTube comments as well. Let's take a look. Green Skyline is saying, I'm still annoyed that Strickland came into the fight thinking he'll outstrike Pereira. Anyone else had money on him? Yeah, I know, man. I bet on Strickland as well. It was one of those bets where I think a fight like Alex Pereira versus Sean Strickland leaves us in an impossible position as MMA bettors. Like, if Strickland were a decent-sized favourite in that fight, then you can pass on him, no problem, because you know if the fight stays standing, Pereira's going to cause him problems and have a lot of success. But the problem when you see Strickland as a slight underdog or in that even money odds range is you can't really pass on him, because while you know if the fight stays standing, he's going to be in a lot of trouble, you also know that if he comes in with a grappling heavy game plan like he did against someone such as Court McGee, he's probably going to win pretty easily. And then you're left in a situation where if Strickland doesn't fight smart and he keeps the fight standing and he goes out and does exactly what he did and gets himself knocked out, then you're really frustrated at yourself for betting him, because you're like, Jesus Christ, I knew that could happen, you know. Pereira's a dangerous guy on the feet. I knew if Strickland didn't take him down, he'd be in a lot of trouble. But then in an alternate universe, in a parallel dimension, if you pass on Strickland and he comes out, shoots a nice deep double leg in the first minute, takes Pereira down and dominates him on the ground for 3 rounds, then you're going to feel like an absolute dum-dum for not betting Strickland in the even money odds range or as a slight underdog. So fights like Pereira and Strickland are really, really difficult from a betting point of view, because there's like 2 ways that the fight could play out, and they're both extremely different from one another, but they're both kind of as likely as the other, you know. And if Strickland would have fought smart, that one could have played out very differently. But you've also just got to kind of shake your head and be like, what were you thinking? You know, what were you thinking? Like, Strickland said that he felt the fight was going well for him. I strongly disagree, man. All I saw was him following Pereira around the octagon, and Pereira just chipping away at him from behind the jab, outstriking Strickland by a wide margin. I think Pereira had racked up a lot of volume in the 2.5 minutes of the fight lasted, and I don't recall Strickland landing a single strike in the first 2.5 minutes. So when Strickland was like, I'm seeing everything, I felt comfortable, like I felt great in there, I'm like, okay dude, whatever, because from my perspective you were getting lit up, you know what I mean? Murder. What I will say is, though, it wasn't like the loss, because I lost money on Strickland as well, but it wasn't like it was super shocking or super surprising. We were talking about it in the breakdown video, how Strickland is the exact kind of guy that will go out there and try and win a kickboxing match against a better kickboxer. Like, he's a crazy dude, right? He's wild. He wants to put on exciting fights. You know, I gave him the benefit of the doubt and hoped that he would grapple, but unfortunately he didn't, and that was one of the risk factors, right? It wasn't like I felt confident or anything that he would grapple. I had the feeling he would try and stand and bang, and man, he had a golden opportunity to win the belt, because if he did use his grappling against Pereira and Izzy, I think, you know, with how bad Izzy looked on the ground against Jan Blachowicz, I think Sean Strickland had a great chance of winning the belt, but not going to get an opportunity now because tried the kickbox with an extremely good kickboxer, which doesn't make any sense at all. It's funny because I remember there was a Looking for a Fight episode a few years back. If you can find this, it's definitely worth checking out. It's when I think they go to Dubai, and Dana White and Dean Thomas and that, they do like indoor skydiving, and they go to, I think it's an Abu Dhabi Warriors event, and Khabib meets them there because one of his guys is fighting on the show, and Dean Thomas was talking to Khabib about his philosophy and his approach to MMA and how he was so successful. And Khabib said that the critical success factor for him, the thing that separates, you know, your average fighter, your average career UFC fighter from someone that becomes a champion and achieves greatness, is that champions understand what they are and they fight to their strengths. He's like, the biggest mistake people make is that really good grapplers fall in love with striking and then try to strike, and then really good strikers fall in love with grappling and they try to grapple. Like, if you think of the greats like Anderson Silva, he didn't try to take anybody down. He knew he was an elite striker, so he just struck, right? You look at Khabib, you know, when would Khabib try and win a kickboxing match? Did you ever see a fight where Khabib would stand and strike for 25 minutes? No. As soon as he could go to his grappling, he did, because that's what he's great at. That's what his strength is. You can't be great at everything, right? Jack of all trades, master of none. You look at Izzy now. You don't see Izzy trying to take dudes down. He's a high-level striker, so he focuses on striking. And Khabib was saying in this episode of Looking for a Fight that that's the mistake a lot of these up-and-coming guys make. They deviate from what got them to the dance. And when you look at Sean Strickland's background, I know that Michael Bisping said that he wasn't a particularly good wrestler. And I know Michael Bisping's coming from a really educated point of view when he says that, because he trained with Sean Strickland for a long time. But at the same time, you don't need to be a really good wrestler or a really good grappler to take a guy like Pereira down and cause him big problems on the ground. And if you look at Strickland's lineage, he comes from Team Quest, which was a predominantly grappling-based gym. You know, Strickland in his early 20s was training with guys like Matt Lindland, Randy Couture, Ed Herman, Chael Sonnen, you know, Joe Warren, for fuck's sake. Think of all these beasts that built a career from grappling that Sean Strickland has trained with from a very young age. And we've seen Strickland use grappling in past fights. Like, go look at his fight against Court McGee. So it's not like Strickland couldn't do it. He could do it. You know, I admit it's not his strong suit. I agree with Bisping in that respect. But it's not like Strickland couldn't at least try to grapple and he fucking didn't. So it's like, oh, fuck. You know, that's fighting though, right? Every week we talk about the most difficult aspect about making money from betting on MMA is trying to work out what fighters are going to do. Because you can research their skill sets and you can research what their paths to victory are, and then you can, you know, assign probabilities to how likely each outcome is going to be based on how two fighters match up stylistically. But ultimately, we're not betting on robots. And when you've got situations where a fighter can utilize multiple different game plans and strategies and take different paths to victory, very difficult to predict what path they'll walk. Like this week, for example, we know this is a really good example, actually, right? I'll talk about this now because I think it's really relevant. But basically, in the breakdown video for this event, we were talking about how Jared Vandeira would have a huge advantage on the ground over Chase Sherman. Both guys are extremely low level on the ground. Both Vandeira and Sherman's weakness is on the ground. They're both very low level grapplers. They both have bad takedown defense. But the thing is, that doesn't matter, because even though both guys are awful on the ground, Vandeira is still a tiny bit better, which means if Vandeira were to come into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, he'd have a lot of success. But the problem is, Vandeiro obviously, grappled a lot with Olenek in his last fight. He struggled on the ground against Sergey Spivak. He got dominated on the ground by Alexander Romanov. So Vandeiro can't see that his easiest path to victory in this fight is actually grappling. Because his own weakness is on the ground, he can't understand that that's okay because Sherman's issues on the ground are far bigger. And this week in the Fight Week interviews, I've watched some interviews with Jared Vandeiro this week, and he's saying that he thinks Chase Sherman's going to try and take him down, and that he needs to keep the fight standing in order to win. And I'm like, oh my God, bro, no, that's wrong. That is completely wrong. Even if Sherman does try to take you down, you should embrace that because you're a way better grappler than Sherman. But in Vandeiro's head, he doesn't understand that. So this is a really good example of a fight where Vandeiro has a clear and obvious path to victory, but it's unlikely he's going to take it because he hasn't read the fight correctly. He hasn't done his homework on this matchup stylistically and realised that that's actually a legit path to victory for him. And that's one of the hardest things about making money betting on MMA. A lot of the time these fighters don't understand what the easiest path to victory for them is, and so they don't take it. So when we research it, we're like, oh my God, man, if Tresean Gore just does this, he's going to dominate. It's going to be easy for him. But then he might not realise that, so he goes out and does something completely different. That's where it gets tricky, man. It gets very, very tricky. Off the road, what's up, mate? Hope you're doing good. Off the road is saying Nunes the win's my favourite bet tonight. I think Nunes will be the Nunes household will be very motivated at the moment with the birth of their child. Yeah, you know what, dude? What's really interesting about the Calvillo Nunes fight is because of how bad Nunes' takedown defense is, and because Calvillo's a grappler, Calvillo was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet this week. But I do agree with you, man. I've completely flipped to Nunes now. I think she's more likely to win. So Kovrig is saying, I was amazed when you said the difference in striking of Strickland is not that high from that of Pereira. So the reason why I said that is if you go back and watch Pereira's fight against Bruno Silva, what you can see is that when Silva comes forward and pressures Pereira, Pereira doesn't react well to it. Like, he's very bad defensively. He kind of flinches and moves awkwardly, and he just doesn't look very confident on the feet at all. But I think the reason why Pereira looked bad on the feet against... sorry, let me just delete this. Otherwise it's going to keep pinging and irritating everyone. Sorry, guys. We'll get rid of that. Had my emails open, my Outlook, so it's just going to keep pinging. Anyway, what I was going to say was, I think the reason why Pereira didn't look too good on the feet against Bruno Silva was because Silva was trying to take Pereira down early, so the threat of the takedown was there early in that fight. So I think Pereira couldn't show his striking at his absolute best because he was worried about being taken down. And of course, if you can't fully focus on striking, if you have to have one eye on defending a takedown as well, it's going to affect, it's going to affect how effective your striking is, right? It's going to affect how good you are defensively, because when your opponent comes forward, you're not going to know if, strikes are coming or if a takedown attempt is coming. And when a guy gets in close to you, again, you don't know what they're going to do. So you're going to be a lot less comfortable, a lot worse defensively, because you've got to keep your options open, right? You've got to consider the threat of takedowns and striking. So I think the reason why I said I didn't think the striking skill gap would be that big is because I thought with the threat of Strickland's takedown, with the threat of Strickland's wrestling, that would close the skill gap when it comes to striking, because Pereira wouldn't be able to fully open up. But that's not happened, because that didn't happen, because in the first 2.5 minutes of the fight, Strickland just walked forward like a zombie. There were no feints. He didn't feint any level changes, didn't attempt any takedown attempts at all. So Pereira could just counter-strike and pick him off as he came forward. I think the striking would have looked very different if Strickland would have at least tried to take Pereira down early, because then Pereira wouldn't have been able to settle into a rhythm and look so fluid and open up so much on the feet. So, yeah, it's a complicated fight, man. I could be wrong, but that's kind of how I interpreted what happened. Because if you look at the difference between Pereira in the Strickland fight and Pereira against Andreas Michailidis and Bruno Silva, like, fucking Pereira looked way better on the feet against Strickland. And I think that's because both Michailidis and Silva tried to take Pereira down. Yeah, you're right, Skyline, man. Pereira might be the deadliest guy in the division. You know when like Jiri came along in the light heavyweight division, and you could see the guy was just dangerous. Like no matter who Jiri stands in front of, you know every single second he's in there, he's gonna stand a good chance of knocking his opponent out. I feel like that with Pereira, man. That guy is vicious. Like it's not easy to knock Strickland out. What Pereira did to him is super impressive. KCOH, hope you're doing good, mate. What's up, dude? KCOH is saying the way Pereira set up Strickland was world class. He knew Strickland wanted to wrestle, had a huge advantage on the ground, so he allowed Strickland to control the striking early, which led to Strickland feeling he was comfortable. That's a really good point. I didn't even think of that. What KCOH is saying is that Pereira might have played a little bit of possum and kind of let Strickland think he was doing better than he actually was, and obviously then landed the kill shot out of nowhere. That's a really good point, man. Alright, hey, nice one, George. Thanks a lot for the kind words. Nice one, dude. Really appreciate it, George, mate. So yeah, let's get back to these over-unders, man. We're now going to focus on the fight between Cody Brundage and Tresean Gore. So let's take a look at the odds on this one. So, okay, this one's an easy one for me. So, fight goes to a decision. The slight underdog odds are about 2.0. Fight doesn't go to a decision is around an average of, say, 1.77, which is minus 130 for an implied probability of 57%. So this one's an easy one for me. I think this fight is far more likely to end inside the distance. I actually think there's a bit of value here, man. I might actually go for this one myself. That's another bet that I like here. So I'm just going to quickly add this one in. Quickly type this one in. So I do think it is possible to find a lot of value in over-unders when the general betting public hasn't interpreted a fight correctly. Now, we never know what's going to happen in a fight, right? All we can do is research both fighters and make the best decision possible with the information we've got available. But there is a narrative floating around in the MMA community this week. The Tresean goes like a passive, low-volume, tentative guy. I don't agree with that at all, man. I think that perception is coming from his debut against Brian Battle, where Brian Battle kind of dictated the pace, peppered Gore with strikes, outworked him by a wide margin, and Gore just didn't answer back. You know, he allowed Battle to kind of chip away at him, rack up a lot of volume. But I think that was just because Gore was overwhelmed. You know, it was his UFC debut. He's a young guy. Battle fights at an extremely high pace. You know, very, very few guys are going to be able to keep up with the pace that Battle sets. So I think Gore was kind of holding back in order to pace himself so that he didn't burn himself out, because it's extremely difficult to fight at the pace that someone like Brian Battle fights at. It's unsustainable. But if you go back and look at Tresean Gore's fights on The Ultimate Fighter, and before that, he was a lot more aggressive. And so I think we'll see a much more aggressive version of Tresean Gore in this fight. The reason why I like this one to end inside the distance is because we know that Tresean Gore has a huge advantage on the feet. And if the fight stays standing, I don't think this is going to be like the Brian Battle matchup where Gore stands back and has long periods of inactivity, because there's no need for him to. Brundage is very bad defensively. He's very slow and clunky on the feet. He's going to be a sitting duck to the knockout. And we also know that Brundage is the kind of guy that slows down a lot as fights wear on. So the reason why I like this fight to end inside the distance is that even though I do accept Gore isn't the most aggressive guy in the world, what we do know is that he's got great cardio, fast hands, and legit one-shot KO power. And we know Brundage is likely to slow down a lot as the fight wears on. And if Brundage does slow down, you know, like he did against Nick Maximov in his UFC debut, I think he's going to be too tired to defend himself. I think he's going to be too tired to alleviate the trouble he's in on the feet with his wrestling, because he's going to be too tired to get Gore down. And as a result, I think he's going to be too tired to defend himself on the feet, which means Gore is pretty likely to get a knockout in my opinion. So I like this one not to go the distance in that even money odds range. That one was a nice easy one to cover. So next fight, let's talk about the Antonina Shevchenko versus Courtney Casey fight from an over-under point of view. Where are we? Alright, here we go. Over-unders on Shevchenko Casey. Right, how are we looking at this one then? So, wow, odds are very, very steep. So fight goes to a decision is in the 1.50 odds range, which is minus 200. And fight doesn't go to a decision is around about 2.50, which is plus 150. Interesting. So I guess this is the first sort of over-under on this entire card where my pick for the over-under is not what I think the most likely outcome is. I think this fight is more likely to go the distance, but you're kind of paying a steep price on that with the odds. I would actually prefer to bet on this fight not to go to a decision. I think betting on not to go to a decision at plus money underdog odds gives you a better risk to reward ratio. The reason why I say I think this fight is less likely to go the distance is because we know... No, sorry. The fight is more likely to go the distance, but it does have a reasonably good chance of ending inside the distance because we know Shevchenko's submission defense is very, very bad. She showed that in her last two fights against Casey O'Neill and Andrea Lee. She really, really struggles to defend herself on the ground, and for whatever reason, Shevchenko tries to take down everyone that she fights. You know, if you go back and watch all of Shevchenko's fights in the UFC, she tries to take everyone down, man. Like, it's very, very strange considering she's a kickboxer. She's like a moth to the bug zapper. She just gets sucked into these grappling exchanges, and we know that on the ground Courtney Casey's got nasty arm bars, nasty triangle chokes. So I could see Casey submitting her on the ground here. So even though it's more likely this fight goes the distance, odds of 1.50 minus 200, pretty fucking steep. So I won't be betting this one myself. But if you want to roll the dice, take a little shot. I mean, maybe probably better off to go with the fight doesn't go to decision. But I don't feel great about that one at all. So now let's talk about the next fight, which is going to be Ayman Zahabi against Ricky Turcios. Let's take a look at the odds on this one. So fight goes with... Okay, so it's in the even money odds range. Fight goes with decision 1.74. Fight doesn't go to decision 2.15. So that is going to be, for everyone in the US, minus 135 on to go the distance, is it? Yeah. Minus 135 to go the distance, plus 115 to not go the distance. So I would say it's actually kind of a tough one, this one, man. I can see why this is in the even money odds range. So the reason why this one's in the even money odds range is because, on one hand, neither of these guys are particularly dangerous. Like, Ayman Zahabi is kind of a low-volume, well-rounded grinder that can kind of hold his own everywhere, but isn't particularly dangerous anywhere, and isn't that reckless. Zahabi is your typical tri-star fighter that's very well-trained everywhere, can hold his own everywhere, but isn't a dangerous submission grappler, doesn't really have knockout power in his hands. Even though he has got some knockouts on his record, some submissions, he's not that dangerous. So, on that, if you look at it from that perspective, it's unlikely Zahabi gets a finish here. However, Ricky Turcios is super reckless. Very bad defensively, both on the ground and on the feet. And so when you've got a guy like Turcios that's so reckless and so bad defensively, you don't necessarily need to be that dangerous in order to knock him out, hurt him very bad in the feet, or put him in a bad position on the ground. Now, what Turcios has got going for him is that he's extremely tough, extremely difficult to put away. However, he's very, very bad defensively, man. I think Turcios is one of these guys who's really going to start to struggle as he starts to face a higher level of opponent. On the flip side, though, Zahabi isn't the most durable either. We've seen him get wobbled and dinged a few times in his past fights. So I'm really struggling with this one, man. Really, really struggling. I'm going to say, I'm not going to be betting this one myself, but I'm going to say this fight is more likely to go to a decision. And the reason why I say that is because Ayman Zahabi doesn't really have the killer instinct. And so even though Ricky Turcios is very low level, both standing up and on the ground, it's not going to be easy for Zahabi to put Turcios away, because he's very tough, he's very scrappy. Turcios is the kind of guy you have to practically kill in order to beat. So, if Zahabi were to win, I think it would be more likely that he would kind of use his superior skills to kind of outclass Turcios, but not take that extra step to go for the kill and get a finish. If Turcios were to win this fight, he would likely just outwork and out-hustle Zahabi everywhere, but Zahabi is likely too well trained and too good defensively to get himself into trouble and be finished by a reckless, sloppy guy like Turcios. So that's why I think the fight's more likely to go to a decision. I don't feel great about it, because ultimately Turcios is a wild guy, bad defensively, loves to turn fights into these chaotic brawls. So on that side of the, from that perspective, it doesn't make me feel great saying this one's more likely to go the distance. But then on the other side of the coin, Zahabi's pretty good defensively, well trained everywhere, so it's not going to be easy for Turcios to get him out of there, and Turcios is very tough, so it's not going to be easy for Zahabi to get him out of there either. So we'll go with that, man. Next fight. The next one is going to be, interesting, Cynthia Calvillo against Nina Nunes. So let's take a look at the odds on the over-under for this one. Okay, virtually identical to the over-under on Casey and Antonina Shevchenko. So, how do I see this one going? This one's actually very difficult. I think this fight is more likely to go to a decision. And the reason why I say that is because even though Nina Nunes is at a very, very low level on the ground, like super low level, and if Cynthia Calvillo does get this fight to the ground, Nunes is going to be in a lot of trouble. The reason why I see this one more likely going the distance is because Nina Nunes obviously trained at American Top Team for a very long time. She is I'm not sure. Yeah, she's the wife of Amanda Nunes. She's got the fucking surname Nunes. She's not called Nina Ansarov anymore. So yes, her wife is one of the greatest female fighters of all time. High-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, which means she's had high-level training partners at American Top Team for a very long time. Her submission defense is going to be decent, and this is reflected in her record. She's had 17 pro fights, and she's only been submitted one time ever by Mackenzie Dern, who's one of the most dangerous submission grapplers in all of the women's divisions. And to be fair, she tried to fight that armbar, man. She hung in there for a while. She hung in there for a lot longer than a lot of girls do when they're defending submissions against someone as dangerous as of a submission grappler as Mackenzie Dern. So even though Cynthia Calvillo is very dangerous on the ground, sneaky back takes, very good grappling control, very good back control, and sneaky rear naked chokes, Nina Nunes is probably skilled enough to defend those positions. And on the flip side, if the fight were to stay standing and Calvillo weren't able to get the fight to the ground and put Nunes in bad positions on the ground, we know that Nunes is more of a volume striker, doesn't have that one-shot KO power. She's not going to pose too much of a threat to Cynthia Calvillo on the feet, and we know that Calvillo is pretty tough on the feet. On top of that, another reason to like this fight to go the distance is Calvillo doesn't actually try to take her opponents down very much. You'll probably see one takedown per round, absolute maximum from Calvillo. So even if Calvillo were to get this fight to the ground, because she doesn't grapple that much, you're probably not going to see that much of this fight on the ground, which reduces the amount of time that Nunes is going to be in danger defending submissions. So I'm not going to be betting the over on this myself, because at 1.50 minus 200, those odds are pretty steep when you've got, how chaotic of a sport MMA is. And to be fair, Calvillo is pretty nasty on the ground. But this one should go the distance, man. I'd be surprised if we got a finish here. So hope you found that one useful. Let's take a look at the next fight now, which is going to be Jamie Malarkey against Michael Johnson. So, there's quite a big odds spread on the over-under odds on this one. We can see that anything from 1.53 to 1.64 on the over-under, on the under 2.5 rounds. So if we meet in the middle and say like 1.60 maybe on the under, 1.60 minus 167 for an implied probability of 63%. and then the over about, just say an average of like what, 2.35 maybe 2.30, something like that, which would be plus 130 for an implied probability of 43%. So I have actually bet the under on this fight. I went 2 units under 2.5 rounds at odds of 1.59, 1.70. Sorry, minus 170. So the reason why I really like the under on this fight, this is probably my favourite over-under bet on the entire card. The reason why I really like this one is because it goes back to what I was saying with the under on the Carl Roberson versus Kennedy and Chukwu fight, where both of these guys can contribute to the bet winning. So Jamie Malarkey will be dangerous on the feet because at this stage in Michael Johnson's career, he can't take a shot like he used to. His reflexes aren't as good as they used to be. His chin's not what it used to be. We know Malarkey is an aggressive guy on the feet that hits hard. And in the last few years, we've seen Michael Johnson run into trouble on the feet against Clay Guida and Alan Patrick. And obviously, Malarkey's a much better striker than those two guys. So I think there's a good chance that Malarkey can knock Michael Johnson out on the feet, which is one way that this fight could end under 2.5 rounds. On top of that, though, we've seen Malarkey get rocked, dropped, wobbled in most of his fights in the UFC. Jalen Turner wobbled him multiple times, finished him with strikes in round 2. Devontae Smith wobbled him, and Brad Riddell dropped him and wobbled him multiple times as well. And they say power's the last thing to go. So even though Michael Johnson's on a very steep decline, he still hits pretty hard, and Malarkey is pretty bad defensively. So that's another way that the fight could end at under 2.5 rounds, where Michael Johnson could contribute to that bet winning. But then the third way that we could see the fight end at under 2.5 rounds is the fact that we've seen Jamie Malarkey attempt to use grappling heavy game plans in a lot of his in a lot of his recent fights. He tried to use a grappling heavy game plan against Riddell, did use a grappling heavy game plan against Fariziem, and while Jamie Malarkey's not the best grappler, not that skilled on the ground, it's not like he's particularly dangerous on the ground, you don't have to be with a guy like Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson's a guy that, is pretty easy to take down. And what you notice about Johnson is if you put him in bad positions, if you put him in bad positions on the ground, Johnson is a guy that will look for a way out and look to quit. So if Malarkey takes him down, gets into top position, starts smashing him with ground and pound, or gets to Johnson's back, we've seen Johnson turtle up on the ground many times. We've seen him give his back up or give up weak submissions and wave the white flag. And so there's multiple ways in which this fight could end inside the distance, which is why I really like the under here. Out of all the over-under bets I've got on this card, man, this one's by far my favourite. I absolutely love this one. So I'd be really surprised if this one went the distance. Like I say, whenever you've got a fight where there's so many different ways it can end inside the distance, the more ways you've got a fight can end inside the distance, the less likely it is that it goes the distance. It's just common sense, right? Let's catch up on some comments on YouTube. What have we got? Hey, what's up, MTez? Good to see you, mate. Hope you're all doing good, MTez, mate. KCOH is saying I've got Tresean Gore, Cody Brundage starting round 2 in a parlay. Both guys haven't been finished in the first round, but I think eventually Brundage's pressure will force a second or third round finish. Wow. KCOH, I will say this. I would be absolutely amazed if Brundage finished Gore in rounds 2 and 3. Based on Brundage's past performances, I just don't see it, man. Like, Brundage's gas tank is really bad. So, from my perspective, the longer the fight goes, the less likely it is that Brundage has success. So if Brundage were to get a finish in this fight, you'd think he would be in round 1 when he's at his most dangerous. The longer the fight goes, the better it gets for Gore, because Gore's gas tank is amazing, whereas Brundage slows down a lot. So I honestly think that the probability of Brundage getting a finish in rounds 2 or 3 is very unlikely, mate. I think Brundage's best hope of getting a finish in this fight is to catch Gore cold in a submission that he doesn't see coming. Like, how Jalen Turner just locked in that guillotine and caught Brad Riddell last week in like the first 30 seconds. He needs to do something like that. The longer the fight goes, if you let go, settle down, get comfortable in there, I think Brundage's going to be in a lot of trouble, man. Hey, what's up, Hilt? Good to see you, dude. Oh yeah, that's another thing. Green Skyline and KCOH are just talking about the Courtney Casey submission. That is a really good prop for this weekend. So I'm not a fan of props because they've got a low win rate. But if you're a value better, if you really like to take value bets, I do think the odds on Casey to win by submission are fantastic. Now, it's not super likely to win. You know, only 27, I think something like 27% of fights end by submission. So it's not like Casey by submission is going to win a really high percentage of the time, but it doesn't need to at these odds. You know, 8.0, which is going to be plus 700, gives you an implied probability of, you know, 12.5%. I think that's a great value prop, man. I really, really, really like this. Because like I say, Shevchenko, for whatever reason, even though she's a striker, she tries to take everyone down. Like, all of Shevchenko's fights turn into grappling matches. And we know Shevchenko's submission defense is really bad. So with how tricky Casey is off her back with her arm bars and triangles, I love this prop, man. Like I say, I don't expect it to hit a huge percentage of the time. But I definitely think there's a little bit of value there, man. No doubt. No doubt, no doubt. Oh, hope you're doing good, Quad, mate. How you doing? Good, man. Hope you're doing good, dude. Quad's been hit hard by COVID, man. COVID hit the shit out of me earlier this year. Hopefully you're feeling better, Quad, mate. And Bunkhoots is saying, what time do the fights start in the UK? I think they start like midnight, man. Something like that. So I'll be on my natural energy drinks, man. And trying to stay awake throughout the night while we live bet it. Hopefully we can do good tonight, man. We haven't been doing good in live betting these last 4 or 5 weeks, so I'm hoping to bounce back with a big win tonight, man. It's brought the vibe down of the website, actually. You know, if you look at our performance when it comes to live betting, we make money almost every month. You can see from when I started tracking results back in 2016, just nice, steady, consistent gains pretty much every month, and we very, very rarely have losing months. But as you can see, last month we had a nasty losing month last month for the first time in a while. It's just brought the vibe down of the website, man. You know, it's a little bit quieter. People aren't as positive in the last 4 or 5 weeks, so hoping to bounce back with a big win tonight, man, and lift the mood again. BP is asking for an early prediction on Vince Pichel against Jesse Ronson. I'm not sure about that one, man. Vince Pichel's a strong grappler, and even though, how old is he now, like 39, 40 years old, even though Vince Pichel is super old now, he can still fight and grapple at a decent pace for 3 rounds. Like, he held his own against Madsen in his last fight, and we know Madsen is such a strong grappler. For me, that seems like a really good fight for Vince Pichel, because even though he's old and it's tough to trust guys in their late 30s, we saw Jesse Ronson completely capitulate on the ground in his last fight. In my opinion, you know, Vince Pichel's a far better grappler than what Jesse Ronson had to face last time out. So if Ronson struggled in his last fight, I think he's going to struggle even more against Pichel. What are the odds on that one, man? Let me just... Oh, there's no odds out on Best Fight Odds yet. Yeah, let us know what the odds are on that one, man. I think that's a pretty good fight for Pichel. Yeah, Quad is saying that... Yeah, we were saying earlier on, I agree, man. Ayman Zahabi doesn't really have that killer instinct. BJ saying, did Zahabi work his way through a lower league or get a call up because of his brother? Yeah, I think he did, man. He had a few fights outside the UFC, but not many. He did come into the UFC very early in his career. We could see he's only had 10 pro fights, and he came into the UFC after just 2 for 6 pro fights. And you can see the guys that he was facing is super low level: 0-5, 4-6, 0-0, 7-8, 2-0, 3-1. So yeah, he has been fast tracked in the UFC, like you say, probably due to him being Faraz Zahabi's brother. Oh, nice one, Jared Powers, mate. I really appreciate the kind words, mate. Thanks a lot, dude. Means a lot, mate. Lamar Lockett is saying, do you like Tercios over 1.5 rounds? Yeah, I do think that fight's more likely to go deeper than early. just because, like I say, Tercios isn't that dangerous. He's more of one of these guys that is like a crazy, scrappy brawler that fights at a high pace and tries to break you down with pressure. And Ayman Zahabi is much more of a technician. He doesn't really have that killer instinct. So with how those two match up, I do think it's more likely to go the distance. But if you rewind a bit in the live stream, as soon as this is done, the live stream will be uploaded to YouTube. We break down that fight from an over-under point of view a bit earlier on, in a bit more depth. Nice one, Jared. Thanks a lot, mate. Nice one, Hagbard, Celine. Cheers, mate. All right, let's get into the next fight from an over-under point of view, which is going to be Jared Vandeira against Chase Sherman. So as you can see here, I have bet the over 1.5 rounds in this fight. I really like the over 1.5 rounds in this matchup. And I think this is another situation where a bit of wiki capping has gone into the odds on this one, because if you look at the records of both Sherman and Vandeira, you can see a lot of their fights have ended very quickly. You know, earlier in Sherman's career, you know, a lot of his fights ended in round 1 and 2. You know, we've seen him lose in the first round of his last 2 fights. And if you look at Jared Vandeira's record, very rare that he goes the distance. I mean, look at how many times this guy's fights have ended inside the distance. So I think what's happening here is the odds have been set on this over-under based on the fact that when you look at the records of Sherman and Vandeira, a lot of their fights end pretty quickly. But when you look at how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, they're not that dangerous. One of the reasons why so many of these two guys' fights end inside the distance is that they're both pretty bad. So when they're facing a decent level of heavyweight, they find themselves in a lot of trouble where they're overwhelmed and they get finished. For example, we've seen both Vandeira and Sherman taken down in recent fights and dominated on the ground. And of course, we know Sherman's bad defensively and very susceptible to the knockout. So I think the over-under on this fight has been set based on the fact that these guys tend to get finished a lot. But what the odds aren't considering is that neither of these guys are particularly dangerous. They're nowhere near as good as the guys that have been finishing them. And so here you've got a pretty well matched fight between two pretty low level heavyweights that aren't that dangerous. Both guys tend to be volume strikers. You know, they don't have that kind of one-shot KO power that you see in a lot of heavyweights. And neither guy is particularly dangerous on the ground either. So this is one of those fights where even though both of them are bad defensively and they do get finished a lot, I think this is a fair fight where neither guy is particularly dangerous enough to finish the other. So I absolutely love the over 1.5 rounds in this matchup. I think that wins a decent percentage of the time, man. Alright, let's get into the next one, man. So, the next over-under fight. Okay, this one could be tricky. Said Nurmagomedov against Douglas Silva de Andrade. Look at the odds movement on Nurmagomedov as well. His odds have been absolutely smashed this week. They've tanked since early on in the match, early on in the week. When I started researching this fight on, I think it was Monday, pretty sure Nurmagomedov was a 1.40 minus 250 favourite. So his odds have been fucking assassinated since then. Okay, in terms of over-under for this one, do you know what, man? I'm actually going to say, and this might surprise a lot of people, I do think this fight is more likely to go to a decision. I'm not going to be betting this one myself, but if you do want to bet this fight, I would say, if you do want to bet the over-under on this fight, I would say go for the fight goes to a decision at odds of 2.40 plus 140. So the reason why I say that is because even though Nurmagomedov shares a surname with Khabib, probably the greatest fighter of all time, shares the same surname as Umar Nurmagomedov that looked amazing a few weeks ago against Nate Manez, Said Nurmagomedov is a fighter who doesn't really have the killer instinct. Like, he's not that dangerous anywhere. Nurmagomedov, even despite his surname, is more of a striker than a grappler. But his striking is very technical. He's very defense orientated, where he likes to use his length to fight at a safe distance and chip away at his opponents with range finding strikes. He doesn't really have knockout power. He's not that dangerous on the feet. He's an effective striker because he's excellent defensively. He moves well. He throws a very diverse range of attacks and is very good at doing it in a safe way. So it's difficult to outstrike him, but it's not like he's going to inflict loads of damage on you and knock you out. He's not that kind of striker. And even if he were, Douglas Silva de Andrade is pretty tough on the feet anyway. I know de Andrade is very tough, but we saw in his last fight against Sergey Morozov that his chin's still pretty decent, and he's the kind of guy that you have to practically kill in order to beat, because if you do hurt him, he's going to try and hang in there and try and recover. Nurmagomedov, not too dangerous on the feet, doesn't have that killer instinct. So I don't think it's that likely Nurmagomedov will get a finish on the feet with strikes. Now we know de Andrade has legit one-shot KO power. We know he hits very hard. But I don't think it's that likely he knocks Nurmagomedov out here, because de Andrade is one of these big single punch power shot fighters where he loads up on big singular power right hands. Problem with that is because he's not throwing much volume, not throwing a particularly diverse range of strikes, he's not throwing combinations and setting things up very well. It's going to be difficult for him to land an absolute bomb on Nurmagomedov because of how well Nurmagomedov moves and how good he is defensively. So I don't think a finish on the feet is that likely. Now, Nurmagomedov will have a big advantage on the ground, and he can cause de Andrade a lot of problems on the ground. But again, Nurmagomedov is more of a striker. Despite his surname, he prefers to stand and strike. You don't see Nurmagomedov grapple that much. And while if he did come into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, again, when he does grapple, he doesn't have that crushing physicality that we see from guys like Umar Nurmagomedov and Khabib. And at the same time, Douglas Silva de Andrade is a high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. So even though de Andrade hasn't looked great on the ground recently, he should still know how to defend himself. So even though I expect Nurmagomedov to win this fight pretty comfortably, because he doesn't have the killer instinct, I could see this one going the distance. I'm actually really tempted to bet this. I'm not going to pull the trigger on it right now. We've already got a good number of over-unders for this card. I'm probably going to have some food in the next hour or two and reflect on this one, but I might actually bet a little bit on this, because I do think that Nurmagomedov's surname, him being a big favourite, and the fact that he's Dagestani may be having an influence in the odds without necessarily considering how both guys match up from a stylistic point of view. So yeah, I might go for that one, but I won't make my mind up now because I'm feeling a little bit hungry and might not be thinking straight. I'm going to have some food and then reflect on it a little bit, I think. So next one, Caio Borralho against Armen Petrosyan. So interesting odds on this one. Fight goes to a decision. Odds are around 2.35, which is going to be plus 135 for an implied probability of 43%. And the odds on doesn't go to a decision, quite a big odds spread. Again, call it 1.61 in the middle, which would be minus 164 for an implied probability of 62%. This one's quite difficult to lean either way on, man, with the way the odds are. This one's probably one of the... This fight is probably the one that's giving me the most trouble this week from an over-under point of view, because both guys are very dangerous everywhere. Well, that's not true. Petrosyan's not dangerous on the ground, but he is very dangerous on the feet. Borralho is dangerous on the ground, and on the feet. How do we feel about this one, man? This one's tricky because... Now, I'm going to go with fight doesn't go to a decision here. Thinking about it, if we're using the same logic that we've used, to have a lot of success betting over-unders, then I think this fight is a lot more likely to go to to end inside the distance, because both guys have got lots of ways that this fight could end. So Petrosyan has legit one-shot KO power in every strike. He's very dangerous on the feet, very aggressive on the feet. And we know that Borralho fights with his hands down low, chin up high. So while Borralho does move well, it only takes one shot to put you away, and Petrosian's very dangerous on the feet. On top of that, we did see Baralho slow down a lot on his Contender Series matchup, which means if he does get really tired in the second half of this fight, he might be too tired to defend himself. You know, a lot of Baralho's striking comes from that karate stance, that footwork and that movement. When a fighter starts to get tired, it's much harder for them to stay light on their feet and move around, which would make Baralho more susceptible to the knockout. And we've seen in Petrosian's debut against Gregory Rodriguez that he does carry big power deep into a fight. So that's one way the fight could end. On top of that, we know Baralho is very dangerous on the feet. Now, Petrosian showed off an amazing chin in his debut against Rodriguez. We all remember that giant head kick that Rodriguez landed on Petrosian up against the cage to crush Petrosian's nose in the third round of his last fight, and Petrosian hung in there. But Baralho is a big, scary, skilled Brazilian, and again, it only takes one shot to land and knock you out. So that's another way the fight could end. But on top of that, we know that Baralho is a decent grappler, dangerous submission grappler, and Petrosian is very, very low level on the ground. So Baralho could submit him in the ground or tie him up in a bad position and stop him with ground and pound. So there's multiple ways this fight could end inside the distance. That's why I think this one is more likely not to go to a decision. The odds are too steep for me to bet, though. I'm not interested in betting this. I think those odds are way too steep at like 1.661. I don't think there's any value in that. But if you do want to bet this fight, you know, from an over-under point of view, I do think it's more likely to end inside the distance. So the final fight now that we're going to go through is Dos Anjos against Fiziev. And to be fair, I do think this fight is more likely to go to a decision. I'm not going to be betting it myself because Fiziev has legit one-shot KO power. Dos Anjos is getting old now. It only takes one shot to put you away. But I do think it's fairly likely this one goes the distance for a couple of reasons. The first reason being, Dos Anjos is incredibly tough and incredibly well-rounded. Even in his late 30s, he's still extremely difficult to put away. If you look at his record, this guy is an absolute decision machine. The last time he was finished was all the way back in 2016, and it was a flash KO. So this guy, even at this stage in his career, hasn't been finished in 6 years. And while Fiziev is very dangerous, there's no doubt that Fiziev is a very dangerous opponent with legit one-shot KO power. You look at the guys that RDA has been facing that haven't been able to get him out of there. It is not going to be easy for Fiziev to get a finish tonight. So that's one of the reasons why I like this one to go the distance. On the flip side, we know that we've seen two very different versions of Fiziev in his last two fights. He came out crazy aggressive against Bobby Green, burnt himself out early, adrenaline dumped, and slowed down a lot in rounds 2 and 3. He then learned his lesson in his most recent fight against Brad Riddell, where he focused on pacing himself better. Instead of coming out the gate super aggressive and pouring everything into round 1, he spread that output out across the 15 minutes instead, and as a result, his gas tank held up a lot better to the point where he was able to get a finish in round 3 and knock Riddell out, which obviously is a very difficult thing to do when you're tired. So that just goes to show how fresh Fiziev was in his last fight, how well his cardio held up. So for that reason, with this being Fiziev's first ever 5-rounder, and it being pretty clear that Fiziev's learned from the mistakes he made in the Bobby Green matchup, I think we're going to see him come out and fight at a much slower pace here tonight, be less aggressive, not commit too hard to the knockout, try not to get into any crazy exchanges, which significantly reduces the probability that we'll see this fight end by knockout. Because obviously if Fiziev is fighting safer and smarter and slower and more tactically, he's not going to be in positions where he can land that kill shot as frequently as if he came out aggressive like he did against Bobby Green. So that's another reason why I think this one's likely to go the distance. Now, with Fiziev's pacing, I'm sure that he is going to try and fight at a much slower pace. But the big risk factor to this fight ending inside the distance would be if Dos Anjos doesn't play that game. And if Dos Anjos, banks on his cardio and conditioning versus Fiziev, and Dos Anjos comes out the gate very aggressive early and forces Fiziev to fight at a very, very high pace early on. If he does this, we're very likely to see Fiziev fade in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds like he did against Bobby Green. But in order for that to happen, I think Dos Anjos has got to go hard early, put money in the bank later on in the fight by forcing Fiziev to exert tons of energy early and fight at an unsustainable pace. And if he does that, that's obviously going to increase the probability of this fight ending inside the distance when later on in the fight, in that third, fourth, fifth round, it becomes possible that Fiziev could be too tired to defend himself. Although we've spoken a lot, in this this live stream about fighters that lack that killer instinct. There's a few of them on that, on this card, and you could say that Dos Anjos lacks that killer instinct too. This guy almost always goes to a decision. Very, very few finishes over the last few years. And even in his last fight against Renato Moicano, where he had Moicano hurt multiple times, took a lot of damage, came really, really close to finishing Moicano. If you go back and watch that fight, at the end of round 4, Dos Anjos had inflicted so much damage on Moicano that the referee got the doctor to kind of check Moicano out and make sure that he was fit to continue fighting. And the fight at the end of round 4 was very, very close to being stopped. And Moicano was busted up really bad. He was wearing tons of damage. He was in a really, really bad way. And Dos Anjos, showing his character and the great person that he is, the guy with incredible integrity and an endless amount of honor, he actually went easy on Moicano in round 5 and kind of took his foot off the gas and tried not to inflict even more damage on Moicano than he already had, which is amusing because Moicano saw that as an opportunity to try and win the fight, and so Moicano actually did reasonably well in round 5 and inflicted a decent amount of damage on Dos Anjos, taking advantage of Dos Anjos' kindness in easing off a little bit. But that kind of just shows that RDA doesn't really have that killer instinct. So even if Fiziev does get tired, doesn't necessarily mean RDA will push hard and seek to get that finish. So for that reason, I do think it's quite likely this one goes the distance. So I hope you found that useful, man. We've just smashed through every single fight on this card, talking about every fight from an over-under point of view. We've obviously got a good number of over-under bets for this week, and hopefully we make more money than we lose. Hopefully we could be profitable this week. It's going to be tough. MMA is a chaotic sport. It's a mad sport, random sport. Never know what's going to happen. Gamble responsibly, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, hopefully we can do well tonight, man. Let me know what you think about these over-unders in the comments, if you agree, if you disagree. And what I'm going to do now is quickly whiz through the YouTube comments, the YouTube chat, and answer any questions you guys have got, and then we'll call it a night. And then good luck to everyone, man. Let's see what we got. So Jared Powers is saying, I was wondering what you do to gauge a fighter's stamina during a fight. Sometimes I think someone's gassed and they come out after the round break and look rejuvenated. So when I'm live betting, the way that I assess how tired a fighter is going to be as the fight progresses is I use a little bit of how they've looked in their past fights. But then on top of that, I also consider how much energy they've exerted. So if, for example, a fight hasn't been contested at a particularly high pace and then someone starts to look really tired, you don't want to jump in and assume that they're gassed, because it might not be that logical if they haven't exerted that much energy up until that point. But if the early stages of the fight have been contested at a really high pace and they've exerted tons of energy and then they start to look tired, it's less likely they're going to catch a second wind and come back into the matchup, because they've already perhaps exerted the same amount of energy you'd expect them to across a 15-minute contest in maybe the first 5 or 6 minutes of a fight, which means they might not have the gas in the tank to continue to perform at a decent level for the remainder of the matchup. So that's kind of how I approach it. I hope that makes sense, Jared, mate. But yeah, that's going to be it for this live stream. Want to say a big thank you to everyone that hit the like button on the YouTube breakdown video this week. Really appreciate it. Everyone that's watched this as well, appreciate you all, guys. And yeah, go punch the bookies in the dick tonight, man. Hope you all do great. Hope you all crush it. Hope you all make loads of money. I'll see you next week, man, with another breakdown video. Nice one, guys. Have a great weekend. Take care, everyone.